Gabriella grew up loved until her sister Lily's premature birth reshaped the family's attention and priorities. Over years, Gabriella becomes invisible at home, achievements ignored, presence sidelined, while Lily receives continual praise and financial support despite inconsistent effort. Gabriella channels isolation into mastery, building an appraisal/authentication business that grows into substantial success. She quietly funds the family for years. At Thanksgiving, she reveals her success and halts the monthly transfers, choosing self-respect over being used. The family reacts with outrage and social media attacks. Gabriella severs ties, secures herself legally and physically, and finds healing and recognition in her career and with her grandmother. The night the world changed smelled like hospitals and winter, antiseptic and exhaust, the faint metallic whisper of a distant ambulance. I remember being 8 and thinking the knocking at the door was just winter mischief. Aunt Evelyn's face had the thin, urgent quality of someone who carries bad news in her pocket. She didn't explain much. She zipped my coat, tucked my school books inside, and folded instructions into my small hands like brittle paper. "Mom's at the hospital," she said. "Bring a coat." We left the porch light burning, the three of us stepping into fog that tasted like breath and salt. My father's grip on my shoulder was gentle, embarrassed almost. There's a kind of shame in not knowing how to hold a child through other people's emergencies. I remember lights in the driveway, a glare against the snow, the muffled geometry of boot steps on the steps. I remember an incubator like a glass coffin and a tiny face wrapped in tubes the size of matchsticks. They called her Lily. That first week, the house rearranged itself around the idea of Lily. Small things shifted. A bottle of sanitizer appeared by the door as inevitably as a hymn. Mom's laughter, once quick and easy in summer, thinned into clinical instructions. "No touching," she said, as if the command could rearrange affection. Dad began to schedule his weekends around machine checks and pediatricians. The living room became a quiet zone, less television, more whispers, more shoes left in the hallway like polite evidence of life diverted. At home, I learned to make myself small. There's an economy of silence you grow into. Lower your voice, close your door, learn the tone that won't sound like a cough. My room turned into a sanctuary that smelled faintly of peppermint oil, Grandma's odd, stubborn defense against the world. It became a place for paperbacks and postcards of far-off museums, where I could press my face against cold window glass and pretend that other cities had room for me. People think invisibility is empty. It isn't. It's full of small, sharp things, the missed smile, the shouted correction that never included your name, the applause that comes for someone else. When I brought home my third-grade math test with a perfect score, I held it in both hands like a present. Mom glanced down at it, then away, past me, toward the baby monitor like a lighthouse beam. "Good," she said to Dad. "Do you remember to pick up tissues?" Lily's runny. She tucked the paper into the recycling, a gentle, unremarkable dismissal. But there were places where my name landed and stayed. At Sugar Pines, under the warm lamplight of pastry case and chatter, Mrs. Lorraine understood the rhythm of someone who needed to be seen. She didn't ask why I wanted to mop floors or slice scones. She handed me a rag and, once, a hand on my shoulder like a steadying stone. "If you work hard," she told me, "someone will notice." Her voice was not pity. It was a kind of promise that would shape the next decade of my life. In that first movie-length winter after Lily was born, I learned another thing. Families protect what they fear losing, even if that protection means losing the people who need them most. I learned to hide not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I learned the way a door closes behind you and leaves the light on for someone else. And in the drawer under my desk, behind the peppermint tin and a stack of library cards, I kept a small scrap of paper with the word scholarship written in a child's block letters. I folded it like an origami promise and believed, for reasons I didn't have words for yet, that someday the people on the other side of that door would have to knock on mine. The bakery bell had a tiny, insistent ring, like applause for small triumphs. I learned the liturgies of that bell, how to slide a tray without smudging glaze, how to make change without waiting to be told I'd done it right. Evenings smelled of butter and lemon and the ache of people who'd worked all day and came in for something sweet. Mrs. Lorraine taught me to read the faces of customers the way my father read physics equations, carefully, with room for surprise. People are full of stories, she said. Your job is to be the quiet place they can tell them. At school, I moved through shelves of textbooks like a careful curator, collecting knowledge that felt like contraband in my own house. I devoured art history the way other kids collected baseball cards, each painting a secret room I could enter. When parents came to school nights, I sat on the back row, pretending not to notice the empty chairs for my parents. When a science teacher asked for volunteers, I raised my hand so casually the world barely felt it. Being competent became an armor, quiet, hard, and gradually impossible to ignore. The first time I handled a piece of jewelry that made my chest tilt, I was 21 and interning in a cramped appraisal office where the light was harsh and the magnifying lens felt like a secular confessional. It was a clumsy brooch, dismissed by the senior appraiser as a costume trinket. But the enamel had a faint, almost forgotten signature on the back. I spent a night cross-referencing catalogs and library microfilms until the city outside slept. When I brought the facts into the meeting, the names, the dates, the wartime provenance, something shifted. The brooch sold for far more than anyone expected. My supervisor's email folded my name into the company's formal record. It felt like someone had finally pointed a flashlight where I'd been standing all along. Those small victories accumulated into habits. I learned how to research provenance the way one learns a second language, with immersion, repetition, and a stubborn curiosity for mislabeled things. I took jobs nobody else wanted, the boxes from estate sales, the tarnished pieces family members assumed had no history. Each find felt like a reclamation not of objects, but of my own attention. Through flea markets and pawnshops, I taught myself to read neglect like a map to treasure. There were setbacks. An auction bid lost at the last second because a shipping crate arrived late. A client who wanted to sell because of bills, not because they loved the ring, a little moral calculus that left a sourness in my mouth. My first proposal to open my own modest practice was met with skeptical laughter from someone I'd hoped would mentor me. But I learned to take disappointment as data. I saved tips and wages in envelopes hidden in a shoebox under a bed. I scribbled business plans on napkins while the bakery hummed after hours. Meanwhile, home life kept its stubborn loop. Lily's world continued to orbit the family calendar. There were recitals, small trophies, and the kind of applause that becomes louder because of its repetition. I watched Lily develop a practiced confusion between gratitude and entitlement. My parents' conversations about money and education circled like migratory birds, always returning to the same anxious center: schedules, tuition, opportunities one was expected simply to accept. So I built two lives, one visible and small, bussing tables, learning discipline, the other clandestine and expansive, learning to trace the invisible marks left on a jewel's reverse, constructing a network of museum contacts and searching archives at ridiculous hours. Both lives required patience. Both demanded I soften the edges of my anger until it became useful, a tool for planning instead of a weapon. When I finally received the acceptance email with the words "full ride," I cried in the bakery's back room where no one could see. Mrs. Lorraine tucked an arm around my shoulder and said, "You were saving that for yourself." That phrase, "saved for yourself," was new. It landed like an instruction. And in the quiet that followed, I began to plot not escape routes, but routes of arrival. Success was a slow accretion of improbable details: a curator who remembered me from a conference, a chance call about a family estate, a misattributed necklace that turned out to be a signature piece. Each win felt like a well-executed stitch in a garment I was sewing for myself. The work was tactile: filing, photographing, magnifying, reading tiny hallmarks like a code, and it was intimate. People entrusted me with the relics of their lives, and I treated those objects like promises. Then came the brooch that changed the ledger of my life. It arrived in an unremarkable padded envelope. Inside lay an enamel swan, the edges engraved with such fine detail that light bent differently across it. At first glance it seemed sentimental. But on the back, beneath years of grime, was a mark so slight it looked erased by time. I spent 3 nights tracing it across faded inventories and war-damaged registry cards until I located a record in a French provincial collection. The artisan's workshop had made pieces for a lineage of families dislocated by war, and one surviving work had been sold under duress. The swan was one of the few authenticated pieces of a maker believed to have perished with his workshop. We reappraised. The number written into the updated catalog changed the expectation in the room. What was thought to be an affordable lot became center stage in a European sale. The swan sold for a sum that left my boss stunned and clients congratulatory in a low, impressed hum. For the first time, the narrative attached to my name shifted. I had earned a line in an internal email, then in a small industry bulletin. It wasn't celebrity, exactly, it was validation that the skill I'd honed in the margins had marketable acuity. But fortune doesn't erase the past. While I was negotiating consignments and liaising with a newly interested auction house, another set of events unfolded quietly in my inbox. My mother's messages, at first routine, began to tilt toward need. Lily's art program has extra fees this semester, the first read. My fingers paused over the keyboard. I had learned not to flinch at requests, but I hadn't expected to become a bank. I routed a transfer that night, and then another the week after, small sums that, when stitched together, made a pattern. I was supporting the family I'd been invisible to for years. There's a particular loneliness in sustaining someone anonymously. It's paradoxical. You are the fulcrum of their comfort, and yet you remain unseen. I justified the transfers with the same logic I used to justify staying late at work. They needed help, and I could provide it. But a seed of unease took root. I understood patronage. I did not want to be the unwanted benefactor who became a lever for control. Money changes how people speak, how they measure love. It rebranded relationships with debt and gratitude, and I found myself holding the balance like a coin that could tip everything. The tipping came slowly. Lily's purchases became more conspicuous, designer posts, photos on beaches with captions about rewarding hard work, and with each public celebration, I felt a small incision of disbelief. How had the child who'd once been swaddled in tubes become the centerpiece of every family cheer? The more I gave, the less visible my labor became. The narrative of me as provider remained invisible because I insisted on being invisible. It was then that I stopped asking permission and began practicing assertion. I opened an account that was mine in the contented privacy of late nights. I registered a business name that felt deliberate and private. And when a major appraisal fell into my hands, an entire estate trove miscatalogued and ripe for proper attribution, I moved with the quiet ferocity of someone determined to be legitimate in the world that had refused me. The auction room became my crucible, and with each confirmed provenance, my confidence hardened into strategy. The midpoint, therefore, was not an explosion but a decision. I would not merely succeed. I would control the terms under which success intersected with family. If I was to give, it would be with my own agency, no guilt, no erasure. That quiet resolution made the coming reveal inevitable. By the time Thanksgiving approached, I had rehearsed a dozen private arguments in my head, and none of them satisfied the ache I'd been carrying. The invitation, sent by my mother with an exclamation point and a pastel emoji, asked if I could host. Hosting felt like a ritual trap, the same table, the same familiar choreography, a meal everyone would remember while forgetting the one who'd arranged it. I decided not to announce myself. I hired a caterer from the city, arranged linens that caught light like jewelry, and coordinated a discreet live feed to an overseas auction. I wanted the dinner to be impeccable, not spectacle for them, but an uncompromised experience I could offer for myself. The house filled with voices that sounded both known and newly thin, and corners bent into the same gossip grooves. My father made his small jokes about the weather. Lily arrived late, radiant in a way that suggested a practiced ease with attention. Her boyfriend hovered like an accessory. The guests murmured at platters, at casseroles arranged like museum displays. For the first time in years, my parents seemed present in a civic way, proud parents of a shining child. I listened to the fragments of conversation while checking bids on a rare Georgian set. Then Lily wandered into the study, all casual curiosity. Her eyes snagged on the laptop, where the auction feed pulsed with the kind of numbers that make bank accounts feel like living things. She smirked in a way that suggested familiarity with the currency of boasting. "Mind if I borrow this?" she said, and before I could rise, she swept the laptop toward the dining room like a triumphant reveal. What she exposed: open tabs, internal ledgers, an email with a contract offering $400,000, and a balance that read larger than the house's mortgage, was documentation of a life my family had refused to see. The table went brittle silent, as if someone had closed a book on the room. Conversations collapsed. My mother, the woman who once brushed my hair, forced a laugh like a broken fan. "Oh, Gabriella," she said, eyes doing careful arithmetic of denial. "You're probably helping someone with paperwork, right?" I could have let the misdirection pass. For years, I'd allowed the family story to be what they needed it to be. But the ledger on the screen had the precise cruelty of proof. I stepped into the light, closed the distance between the laptop and their faces, and spoke plainly. "No," I said. "I'm the one who signs those contracts. I'm the CEO of Aum and Iris. I run 3 offices. Those transfers to your account? They're from me." A fork clattered. The air shifted. What followed felt like an unspooling: accusations, hurt that smelled like entitlement, defenses that pretended to be moral high ground. My mother's voice cut cold with disbelief. "How could you keep this from us?" Lily's eyes welled with something that was equal parts hurt and outrage. My father's hand slammed into the table like a punctuation mark. But what could be said? All the nights I'd gone without, all the scholarship essays typed in a bakery corner, the internships, the unpaid hours, none of it fit inside the vocabulary of their astonishment. Instead of acceptance came a calculus. Why had I not shared? Had I been hoarding? Had I been humiliating them by silence? Their questions were less about my choices than their own wounded pride. I felt the air change in my chest, heavy with a new kind of clarity. I had been generous not to buy affection but to support a family I thought deserved it. The revelation of my resources was a test of character, one I realized I'd been failing quietly for years. When my mother, trembling with anger, asked me to keep the transfers running, I understood what finally needed to break. I canceled the automatic transfers that night. It was simple: a few clicks and a reflection of the boundary I'd rehearsed in solitude. The room erupted into something harsher than grief: rage, accusations, the clattering of utensils like a percussion of entitlement. Their voices formed a chorus that asked me to stay as I had been, silent and serviceable. I had rehearsed responses, calm explanations, financial term, none of it mattered. What mattered was that I chose myself in front of them, and that choice was explosive only because they had never contemplated it. I left before anyone could call a lawyer or issue another insult. The porch door closed with a sound that, for once, felt like a decision and not a surrender. The aftermath was a weather system of texts, calls, and public performances. My phone lit up into a strobe of pleas and accusations. Social media became an arena where family grievances could be curated into sympathy. Lily posted photos with curated sorrow, captions trimmed to sting. "Not everyone with money has a heart," she wrote. The comments divided. Some called me heartless, others called me brave. I read each message like inventory, cataloging who would stand for me and who would attempt to profit from my silence. At home, the anger crystallized into practical threats: legal counsel, whispered plans, relatives who had been casual callers suddenly interested in wills and inheritances. I hired Marcus, an attorney who moved through conflicts with the precision of someone who'd watched many people claim kinship as currency. He drafted cease and desists and labeled harassment for what it was. He wrote a line I insisted on, plain as bookkeeping, mailed to my mother: "Love should never come with an invoice." It was simple and non-negotiable. The public conversation continued to froth. An uncle who'd once called me sweet posted a message calling me ungrateful. My inbox became a mirror of small betrayals and vengeful curiosities. But there was a quieter countercurrent. Clients and colleagues who had watched my work for years reached out with notes of solidarity. One former client who'd once been skeptical called to apologize, then asked me to consult on a European restoration project. It felt like being recognized in a language my family had refused to speak: professional respect. The true climax was not in their outrage, but in the quiet moments I made for myself. Grandma Marie, who had never been afraid of saying what she meant, arrived with a tin of butter cookies and an insistence on staying. She was small and precise, her sky-blue cardigan a constant. Sitting with her in my living room, surrounded by catalogs and quiet light, I unwrapped the threadbare history of my life. She listened without flinching and then, with the bluntness of someone who'd known the shape of pain, she said, "You were never meant to be held down. You were meant to be held up." Her presence was a sovereignty I hadn't realized I needed. Over cups of tea, she told me stories of resilience she'd kept folded away, how she'd discerned value in broken things, how she'd taught me to trust a hand that knew a gem's heartbeat. Her faith was not about money, it was about gravity, the right kind, what draws a person upward rather than pins them to old shame. The emotional crescendo was less an explosion than a settling. I felt the weight of long labor lift like a curtain. The client calls continued, the invitations to speak and advise flew in. For all their protests, my family's reaction did not undo the work I'd done. If anything, their selfishness clarified what I had to protect. That night, I walked through my apartment and touched the objects that had mattered to me since childhood: the swan hairpin, the pearl on a faded chain, my grandmother's notes on the edge of a catalog. I put the swan into a blue velvet box and wrote a single line on a small card, "For the girl who once felt invisible." I realized my life was not a ledger to be balanced by others' opinion, it was an archive curated by my own hand. When lawyers threatened and relatives sputtered, I was prepared. When my mother's voice pleaded over the phone raw and accusing, I could articulate the boundary I'd set in that dining room. It wasn't vindictive, it was final. "You wanted the money more than you wanted to know me," I said. "I will not bankroll the forgetting of my life." Silence followed. It was not the absence of sound so much as the presence of clarity. I had chosen myself, and in that choosing the world rearranged itself in a way that fit me better. The climax was not merely departure, but an ascension into a self I had been building in the margins. It's strange how quiet freedom can feel. After the storm of calls and social posts, the days rearranged themselves into a steadier rhythm. I changed my numbers and strengthened my company's procedures so family members couldn't walk into my office claiming entitlement. I leased a new headquarters, installed a safe room vault, hired staff who understood the ethics of provenance and also of personal boundaries. Business flourished not because I wanted to prove something to them, but because I'd finally allowed my work to be seen without apology. Invitations came from museums, designers, and auction houses who wanted someone who could trace the truth in tarnish. My name began to appear in journals and conference programs, not as an accident but as an earned credential. I traveled once to Paris, where the air smelled of rain and history, speaking about heritage and the moral duties of collectors. I walked on stage once and did not scan the crowd for the faces that had refused me. I held my grandmother's hand instead. Family didn't become simple again. Some members continued to post thinly veiled grievances, others retreated in awkward, private shame. There were occasional calls from my mother, longer, softer, each one a negotiation between pride and need. I sent help for true crises, but I no longer subsidized entitlement. Lily unfollowed my accounts for a while. Later, she sent a message, short, practical, asking for a loan for a studio deposit. I replied with a contract, mentorship hours in exchange for funding. Boundaries make generosity sustainable. What surprised me was how much I healed in the small domesticities. Grandma stayed longer than we'd planned. We sorted collections together at my kitchen table while the kettle sang. On quiet mornings, we drank tea and argued over gem cuts the way other people argue about families, gently, with affection threaded through. She told me once, "You kept your quiet like a treasure." Not everyone understands quiet. Her words felt like a certificate I'd printed for myself in invisible ink. The house I moved into near the lake was modest. A mid-century silhouette, windows wide to water and sky. I designed a tiny gallery there with one shelf for the swan hairpin and a plaque that read simply, "Remember who saw you." It was not ostentation, it was a monument to self-recognition. I slept better than I had in years. Sometimes, late at night, I would open a file and read the names of families I'd helped, estate owners who trusted me to steward their legacies. Their gratitude did not erase the past, but it made a new future legible. I began mentoring young appraisers and interns, teaching them not only how to spot an artisan's mark but how to keep their labor humane. I taught them how to say no. When people ask if I regret the Thanksgiving revelation, my answer is not simple. There's sadness attached to the family that chose appearances over truth. But regret would mean I'd allowed them to continue shaping my worth. I cannot live like that again. The hardest kindness I offered myself was to stop buying other people's comfort. In the end, the swan sat on its velvet shelf under soft light. Its enamel shimmered. I would travel with it sometimes to conferences, but mostly it stayed, a small relic that reminded me how beginning as the overlooked child made me precise and tender in my craft. My grandmother smiled when she saw it, eyes wet and steady. "You did well," she said. "You learned to keep yourself as a jewel." The lake outside my window folded itself into dusk. I poured a glass of tea, put on my grandmother's cardigan, and looked at the quiet collection of things that were, finally, wholly mine. The decision to leave the table had not been easy. It had a cost. But it gave me back the thing I'd been starving for all along, the right to exist in the world on my own terms, unbought and unashamed.